are able to. Here we go. Now we're recording. Wonderful. So glad to see you guys here. Does anyone have any questions starting out? Does anyone have any questions about the quiz last week or the paper that's due this week or anything that's on your mind lately? Okay, great. So what we're doing today is pretty easy. We're just gearing up for French Revolution, which is way fun. It's awesome. It's so much fun to talk about. I mean, it'd be terrifying if you were living in that period in real life. Revolutions are not fun to live through, but from a historical perspective, it's really interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk us through a little bit of context, because your readings for this week are on kind of the beginning of the French Revolution, or at least leading up to it. And the book itself does not do a great job. It does a great job talking about France. It doesn't do a great job talking about the revolution that came just before it, which is the American Revolution. This is something we've been, learning about probably your whole lives. We celebrate July 4th, yada, yada, yada. But it doesn't do a good job connecting the stuff you guys already know about, like American history and overthrowing the government and setting up a better one, connecting that to the French example. So I thought I would do that for you guys. I'm going to do a screen share here. All right. Excellent. And I'll be bouncing back and forth. I'm going to try and invite people into Zoom as we go. I'm getting panicked emails. I'm not really sure why the link isn't working for some people. That's just like, that's how it is. It's really annoying. So, okay, sorry guys. Just need to try and get these people. Okay, so, all right, I lost my PowerPoint. Here we go. Are you guys able to see this? Okay, cool, thank you. So essentially, I'm just going to talk over it, and you guys can take notes as you want. When it comes time for the first exam, this is going to be really helpful, I think, for you guys to bring up in the exam during the writing portion, just like connecting the American Revolution to the French Revolution and finding Enlightenment ideas in both of these things. So I'm not going to talk at length about the American Revolution because you guys have probably heard about this stuff before in a different setting. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the recent Hamilton play, musical, if you've watched that or listened to it, does a really good job of explaining these things. So, but what I want to do is trace the Enlightenment ideas throughout and link the American example with the French example. So on the eve of the American Revolution, there's 13 American colonies. They're all pissed off at Great Britain for one reason or another. Mostly it has to do with not having enough representation in the British Parliament. The Americas are just kind of over here, like on this side of the Atlantic, like, hey, we want to talk about things like lowering our taxes and stuff like that. And the Brits are like, no, you're dirty American subjects. We don't care what you think. So Britain does have a kind of democracy, but it's mixed with a monarchy too. So they have a king who wields a lot of power. They have a parliament who does things like sets tax rates and things like that. So the entire problem with the Americas is the representation in Parliament. So a lot of the taxation comes from the previous wars that Britain had fought, notably the French and Indian War, which a bunch of American heroes served in, George Washington being one of them. Fought for the British against the French in North America. Because of the monumental costs of the French and Indian War, which in your book they call it the 7 Years' War. It's the same war. There's a massive increase in taxes on the American colonials. They have to pay a lot of taxes to kind of make up for the cost of Britain sending a bunch of ships and troops and stuff over to the Americas to defend them from the French. We don't like that because we're Americans and we don't like taxes. Like, that's a pretty constant thing. I mean, humans don't like taxes anyway. So this leads to destruction of property, the Boston Tea Party, outbreaks and violence around the American colonies, and then we eventually get a shooting war that starts in 1775 in the greater Boston area. You guys have heard of, Paul Revere's Ride. You've heard of the battles of Lexington and Concord. That's the first shooting part of the American Revolution, or as it's sometimes called in Western civilization, the American War of Independence. But we can call it the American Revolution. So this drags on for a number of years, and the reason why I'm getting into this stuff is because there's very, 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 very strong Enlightenment ideas here at play. Like, all the things we talked about last week are present in the American example. You don't have to write down, these direct quotes. You can find them in the Declaration of Independence. But when Thomas Jefferson is drafting the Declaration of Independence, he's drawing from these Enlightenment ideas of Rousseau and the social contract. He's drawing from a guy named Montesquieu, who talks about the balance of power in government. He's drawing from these Bonasana, the idea of justice. Like, these are smart guys. The founding fathers are smart, educated guys, and they read their Enlightenment books. So this is evident when you read the Declaration of Independence. This idea, the very first line, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Like, that's an Enlightenment idea that's trying to pull out justice and fairness for everybody, right? Saying that everyone starts on the same playing field when they're born. We're endowed by our Creator, by God, with certain inalienable rights. Life, liberty, pursuit, happiness, right? But this other line too is maybe the more overlooked one, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, right? We need governments to help keep the peace, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In other words, this idea of the social contract, that people give up their rights, the government takes care of the common good, right? That's the social contract. And then this, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. If your government sucks, you can set it up, you can throw it out the window and set up a new one. All right, so that's a direct Enlightenment ideal in our Declaration. And we take this for granted when we take like American social studies classes in school and stuff like that. But this all goes back way longer than just American history. So really quick, the British kick our butts in the first couple of years of the war. Like, you could look at the American Revolution in two main phases. The first phase is the Americans get their asses walloped by the Brits because of just being outnumbered, disorganized. There's a lack of good leadership in the very beginning of the war. We only have like a very thrown together continental army. Most of the fighting is done by militias, just like farmers and city folk with muskets that get together and drill every so often. So the first phase of the war is us getting demolished. Battle of Bunker Hill, even though the British lose more soldiers than the Americans, the British still win the battle, and they take Boston. They take the city of Boston, which was like the headquarters of the revolution at that point. Battle of Long Island, George Washington is in charge at the Battle of Long Island. He has to retreat and surrender New York City to the British. And from then on, New York becomes a headquarters of the British war effort for the rest of the war, because George Washington simply can't defend New York City and the greater kind of lower part of New York State from the Brits. So Like it's just retreat after retreat after retreat. Then things turn and we get a series of American victories. The Battle of Saratoga, which I believe is in upstate New York, is an important battle because it showed that the Americans could organize and could develop cohesive, a cohesive fighting force capable of going toe-to-toe with the British forces. More important than that, though, is it's a battle over the British that proves to the French, who had been on the sidelines the whole time, that maybe they should join the war on the side of the Americans and help out. So the British and the French hate each other. This is like a constant theme in early Western history, like for forever, up until the present. So the British and the French are always fighting each other, and the French see this American independence movement as an opportunity to sucker punch the British and get them fighting on two fronts, which is what they do. So France comes into the war on the side of the Americans, and they supply desperately needed war material like weapons and ammo and troops and reinforcements in the form of, I mean, there's some soldiers that arrive later on. The French don't do a whole lot of direct fighting against the British in the Americas, but they send like the Marquis de Lafayette is over here, and he's helping train American soldiers in the ways of European warfare. Has anyone seen the Hamilton musical on Disney Plus? No?
Yeah.
Oh man, you gotta do it. Okay, a few people. It's
wonderful.
It is. It's wonderful. You haven't lived unless you've seen Hamilton the musical on Disney Plus. Try and do that because it does a really good job of showing the French connection to the American Revolution. Lafayette is a major character in the play. Anyway, we would not have been able to win our independence if it weren't for the French. I'm just going to say, as like a professional historian, you can quote me on that. We would not have a United States of America if France had not stepped in and provided all of these things. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a little bit. The war ends at the Battle of Yorktown. You know, I'm fast forward. I'm skipping a lot of stuff, but look, you can take an American history class and learn all this stuff over again if you really want to, or just watch Hamilton. So Yorktown ends the war, and the reason why Yorktown wins the war is there's a huge British army that's in Virginia. They're trying to retreat to the Virginian coast so that they can jump aboard their ships and then like sail further up north and kind of flank around the American armies. The French arrive with a bunch of warships and they blockade the Virginian coast so that the British can't get aboard their boats. And a British army surrenders, like this huge fighting force in the Americas surrenders to the French and the American forces at Yorktown. So again, if it weren't for the French, we wouldn't be able to pull off the stuff because the American army didn't have any boats. Like there really was no American Navy yet as we knew it. All right, so again, I just want to underscore this because this is important. This is like the reason why I'm talking about this today is because it leads into this other stuff that you're going to read about in the documents that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. France was absolutely crucial to winning the war for the Americas, okay, for the American War of Independence. Absolutely crucial. Like we would not have been able to do it if not for those dirty, smoking, frog-eating Frenchies over there. Sorry, that was a really pejorative thing to say. I have a buddy who's basically he's French, so I pick him on all the time about this stuff. So lessons from the revolution, like how does this then impact what we're going to be talking about and reading about in this class? There's a few different lessons we can tease out from the American Revolution that is directly tied in with the stuff we're reading about. Number one is that kings can lose in a war with their own subjects. Like it is possible for kings to lose their power and have to give that power up to a as Thomas Jefferson says, the governed or the people, right? It's kind of true that kings only remain in power, governments only remain in power by the consent of the governed, with the permission of the people. And the people can take back that power if they feel threatened. Number two, revolutionary republicanism, meaning throwing out a government that's led by a king and setting up a republic where you have like checks and balances in the system. You have, a Congress, a president, a judicial system like we have. That kind of republic, we call that, this is a republican form of government that we have, where there's people who represent the people that are voted into power. And we change out those people all the time. So this idea of that you can overthrow your monarchy and set up a republican form of government, it goes from just being an Enlightenment idea, like, maybe this could work someday, to in the United States, it actually happens, right? Like in the North American British colonies, this idea went from theory to reality. That's a big deal. That's why we're so high on ourselves in America about our revolution. That's why we sniff our own farts and set off our fireworks every 4th of July, is because, like, not only did we gain independence from one of the most powerful nations on earth, but it proved this idea that the people can try and set up what they think is a better form of government than what they had before, right? You don't have to settle for a king. If the king's not listening to you, you kick out your king. You can do this. That's
this is somewhat unrelated, but I read the other day that independence from Great Britain is one of the world's most celebrated holidays.
Yeah, so I don't know. It depends on how you measure that. So there are definitely like other countries that recognize like the 4th of July as being like an important holiday.
I thought it meant like their individual ones.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot, so like we'll talk about this next week, but the French, they have their own Independence Day called Bastille Day, and they kind of modeled it after the 4th of July. So there you go. Yeah, so it's a big deal. And finally, so we have these 3 lessons, right? Kings can lose. You can set up this, better form of government that the Enlightenment eggheads were talking about in their books. Like you can actually do that. And if it can, there's this also like further, it's more of a question, right, than an answer. But if it can happen in America, could it happen elsewhere in the West, right? Could it happen in Europe as well? The hub of Western civilization, this class is Western Civ, right? We have separate classes at Lincoln Land for American history where we just talk about America. The West is broader than that, right? The West, at this point, involves Western Europe, maybe Central Europe, parts of like Germany, for instance, the American continents, and eventually we get like Australia in there too, when the British start colonizing Australia. So the West is a big place. The only place we've really had a successful revolution is in America so far. But because it's successful, then the question is, could this stuff happen closer to home? Could this stuff happen in Western Europe where all the kings actually live? Because it's one thing to like set up a new form of government on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Like we're thousands of miles away from the king. So he can't like come over here himself and put things down. Well, what if these revolutions happened in the king's own backyard? And that's why we talk about the French Revolution. So that's the context that you'll want to have for the readings for this week. The American Revolution kicks off this idea of like, hey, wait a minute, could this actually happen again? Could it happen in a place like Britain or France or Russia or Austria or wherever there's a powerful king? And TJ's right, like it's one of the most celebrated moments because it it kind of kicks off this landslide. Eventually, it's a slow landslide, but 50 years after the American Revolution, we get a lot of revolutions. Okay, so back in France, and this is the last part of the PowerPoint, and then we can talk. Going back to France, and if you haven't already read about the textbook pages, they're going to cover some of this in more detail. But I wanted to make a direct connection from America to France. So back in France, France helps the Americans win independence. Hooray, everything's great, right? Except France is broke. They're a country that is on the verge of bankruptcy all the time. And they have to borrow and borrow and borrow money from international creditors just to keep afloat. The reason for France being broke is that there's a succession of 3 different kings in France. Louis XIV, Louis XV, and then we get to Louis XVI, who's the last king of France before there's a revolution. All of these kings spent money terribly. Like, they are so bad with finances. They are going down to the banks and pleading, and they're going to the payday loans and getting like a high interest short-term loan. Like, they are just really bad with finances for kings. Like, kings are usually a little bit better at managing their countries. Not these guys. They're not very smart. They're full of themselves. They think they're very smart, but they're actually running their country into the ground. So like a typical politician. They spend money that France doesn't have, and one of the big things that puts them really deep in the hole is the American Revolution. So they buy up a bunch of guns and ammo and soldiers' salaries and put it all on credit cards, basically, and send that stuff over to the Americas to help out George Washington and friends. And they succeed in that, right? Their goal is successful. They are able to punish the British and get revenge on the British for taking away Canada and all these other places in the French and Indian War. But France doesn't really have anything else to show for it, right? They spent all this money they didn't have and they put it all on credit. And now it's like, well, the bill's due. What do we do? The French king's kind of idea for fixing the financial issues of France is to tax the common people more and more and more and more. The people who are least able to afford the burden of taxation are the ones that keep getting taxed, right? So this would be the farmers. This would be the merchants in the cities. This would be the blacksmiths. This would be, just kind of common people who are just trying to make a go of things. They see their tax rates increase almost every year. It just keeps getting ratcheted up. And so the common people of France are getting squeezed more and more and more. Meanwhile, the nobles, like the richest 1% in France, they pay little to nothing in taxes. Sound familiar? Right? I don't know how much Jeff Bezos paid in federal taxes, but it was a lot less of a percentage than like what you and I pay from our paychecks. So the tax burden falls upon those who are least able to bear it, and this creates problems, especially when we have a series of unfortunate events happen in France. Like, we have long, harsh winters in France. There's like a period of kind of global cooling that happens right before the French Revolution, like just really bad winters. Crops are devastated by drought and bad weather, and that increases food prices because with less supply, there's more demand. And food prices go up. People are already being taxed to death, and they have trouble affording basic necessities like bread. So this is bad. When the people of France used to be one of the most powerful richest countries in Europe just before this period, like in the early modern period, they were the most powerful nation in the West. And now their own people can't afford bread, right? It'd be like if the cost of healthcare kept going up and up and up in the United States, and people had trouble affording healthcare while, you know, affording other things. That would never happen in the US. Just kidding, that happens every year. So things get bad, and the people start talking about these Enlightenment ideals. They'll say, where's the justice here, right? When is the government of France going to listen to the problems of the people and stop giving tax breaks to the rich? When are they going to do their fair share? When is the king going to realize that he can't draw blood from the stone any longer? So if the government stops being a good government, does it lose its legitimacy? Like, should we even keep listening to the King of France? You know, where's the justice here? So that is where we're going to leave off. Your readings for this week, both in the textbook and for the documents themselves, will pick up on this, and we'll start to see a fuller, richer story emerge from all this pretty soon, right? So yeah, I will post this on Blackboard so that if you want to refer back to it, you absolutely can. Does anyone have any questions about this?
I sent you an email, just ignore it.
Okay. Did you have joining the Zoom chat?
Yeah, I got lost and I was like, I don't know where to go, but never mind.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, it looks like most people were able to join. I got a flurry of emails at the last minute. I tried to help as much as possible before I got into things. But yeah, from now on, the links to Zoom are going to be the same. They're going to be the same every week from here on out. And they're going to be posted. I'll post them every week in the weekly modules. But if you guys ever want to stop in for office hours, in the instructor information part of the menu, you can join my Zoom links there too and join my office hours if you ever have any questions and you just want to chat. Or send me an email, you know, like Isaiah. That's fine too. All right, guys. Well, if you don't have any questions, you know, we can be done for the morning. It won't always be this short, but you guys have a lot to do this week with writing your first paper and doing some readings and all that stuff. So I'll let you go. All right. Have a good week, guys. See you Friday.